Okay, Maryland to Mao. Before we begin, there's some things we need to understand, and I know I can see the shock on some of your faces going, what in heaven's name is this? Okay. There's a couple of big ideas that we need to understand in order to understand the show and what the show is about. The first thing we need to understand is modern art. The work on the left is pre-modern. The work on the right is modern. Modern art begins really at a very particular moment. It begins at not only in the late 18th century, but it begins with a very particular moment when David writes a letter. The work on the left is from the patronage system, and this is typical of pre-modern art, okay? It's called the patronage system because the demands and the interests and the requirements of the patron are paramount, okay? Rigaud did this portrait, and he was told how big it had to be, the accessories that had to be in there, and in fact, Louis XIV made sure that his legs were seen because Louis XIV was 63 years old at this point, and he thought he had unusually sexy legs. And so the legs had to be in there, okay? And the painting isn't done until Louis XIV says, okay, now it's done. That's the patronage system. Now, prior to this, of course, there were artists who worked in a modern way, which is to say, according to their own dictates, but those were the exceptions. The rule was patronage. The modern art, really, you could identify the beginnings of modern art in 1784, when Jacques-Louis David, who had been commissioned to do this painting of the Oath of the Horatii by the state, by the king, wrote a letter back to Rome saying, I am no longer doing this painting for the king, but for myself alone. And that's the moment modern art begins. Modern art, the patronage system is, as I explain to my students every year, is the artist goes into his studio in the morning and waits for the knock on the door for somebody to come into him and says, this is what I want, and this is what I'll pay you. And modern art, on the other hand, is the artist going into his or her studio and deciding themselves what to do. It's about personal integrity. It's about personal expression. It's about, as McDonald's or Burger King or one of those burgers said, it's doing it my way. That's the artist. That's modern art, doing it my way. Okay. The next thing we need to understand is something about portraiture. There are many kinds of portraits, but in the pre-modern period at least, there are two fundamental types. One type is called the state portrait, and that work by Rigaud is a wonderful example of a state portrait. This is a portrait that is aimed at his subjects, and its purpose is to help him be king, to remind his subjects that he is king and they are not. The work on the right is a society portrait. It's a patronage system, but this is not aimed at anyone's subjects. This is a portrait that is called a society portrait because it is meant for members of your society. It is meant to flatter you. It is meant to flatter you and to present and create a certain image of you among the members of your society, of your friends and members of your class, okay? And they're always like this. You're beautiful, you're elegant, and you're rich. Society portrait. Now, the society portrait is continued to be produced in the modern period, okay? And people like Boldini, and how many of you have ever heard of Boldini? 3 of you, okay, 4, okay. And well, the reason you haven't heard of him is that he produced under the patronage system. He produced portraits that flattered his patrons, like Mrs. Howard Johnston here, okay, who is presented as elegant and tall, taller than tall, thinner than thin, with about what looks like a 14-inch waist, okay. Clearly, this is meant again to flatter her, okay. It's patronage again. This isn't done until Mrs. Howard Johnson is satisfied with it. It's the same system. The modern portrait, however, is well represented by somebody like Goya. And the modern portrait wants to give us not flattery, but truth, insight and some kind of depth into the person. And that's what Goya gives us here in his portrait of his teacher, Francisco Bayeux. An image that gives us more than his appearance, more than flattery. It is flattering, but it's much more than that. It gives us some sense of his character, a little dour, a little doubtful, a little insecure. Okay, it gives us some depth. Okay. Now you're saying to yourself, what in heaven's name has this got to do with Warhol's career? And the answer is everything. Warhol's career is divided into three periods: the commercial period, 1949 to 1960, when he moved to New York in 1949, became a successful commercial artist, commercial illustrator until 1960, when he decided to be an artist. Then there's the later pop career, 1972 to 1987, and you're wondering what happened to 68 to 72, and I will talk about that soon. The first phase, of course, is dedicated to commercial art, satisfying the client, satisfying the customer. Now, at the same time he was doing this, he was also producing art. He was also producing art that was his own personal interests and personal expression, the so-called beautiful boy works. But he was primarily a commercial artist who made art part-time on the side. When we move to the early pop period, of course, he gives up commercial art. And this is the period for which he's best known. Okay? This is the period in which he produced these four major themes. I discussed these last time about a month ago when I gave my lecture. The supermarket, homosexuality, movie stars, and death. All of these, of course, are for the purpose of personal expression, integrity. He celebrated the supermarket. He wasn't critical of it. He was a great fan of it as a man from a very, very poor background, poor Depression era background, immigrant background. He thought the supermarket was a pretty terrific thing. Homosexuality, well, he was a homosexual, and he continued to sneak homosexual themes into his work. Movie stars, glamour, movie stars and all that they represented in terms of beauty and glamour that he envied and wanted. And of course, death. Some of these, there is overlap. The Elvis Presley is both movie star and homosexuality. Marilyn is both movie star and death. He began the series right after her death, and he always associated these images with her death. So these were the major themes of his career. Now, the problem was that the works did not sell well. Right now, the works are selling extremely well. But in 1967, his dealer, Castelli, was only able to sell $20,000 worth of his art. And Warhol considered that a disaster because he had bills to pay, and basically out of that he earned about $10,000. And so he was very unhappy about the sales of his work and about Castelli's inability to sell them. And so in 1967, he hired this man, Fred Hughes. Fred Hughes was a businessman, an agent, a Houston businessman, and Warhol hired him to sell his art. And Fred Hughes did a very good job. He sold a large collection of works to the Menil collection, to the Menils in Houston, which is now the basis of the Menil collection. If you haven't been to Houston and seen the Menil collection, it's highly recommended. But they have a lot of Warhols sold to them by Fred Hughes. Fred Hughes also thought that it would be a great idea to start promoting the business of portraits. Warhol had produced a few portraits, for commission portraits now. One of them is shown here. This is Jane Holzer, better known as Baby Jane Holzer. She was the Woman of the Year, I think, in 1964. And this was a commission portrait from her husband. And what Warhol, this is a society portrait. Okay, this is a portrait meant to sell, to promote an image of herself among her peers. So in 1967, he hires Fred Hughes and Fred thinks this is a great idea. We start promoting the business of portraiture, the business of social portraits. The problem was that before this business got off the ground, Valerie Solanas attempted to assassinate Warhol. On June 3rd, she came into the studio and into the elevator, pulled out a gun, and shot him twice through 4 major organs. And as I said to you last time, he was in fact at one point pronounced dead on the operating table. He was able to survive, but it took him almost 4 years to recover. This was a very long and slow recovery. Now, in the meantime, what had happened in the meantime? Partly because of the being shot, it did help his career because it made him more famous, okay? Not a career move I recommend, but nonetheless a career move. And 2 things happened. In 1970, this painting, big Campbell soup can with torn label, sold at auction for $60,000. Now, in today's art market, that's not very much. But in 1960, this was the largest amount of money ever paid for a living American artist. The most money ever paid for a work by a living American artist, okay? And it put Andy at the top of the heap. The other thing that happened in 1970, in the same year, there was a retrospective that traveled across really basically across the West. It traveled and started in Pasadena, to Chicago, to Amsterdam, to Paris, to London, and finally to the Whitney Museum in New York. And again, this was a major career move in his life, and again, elevating his status to a very, very legitimate one. A figure who had been a very controversial artist is now given the stamp of approval by these institutions. So Fred decided, and Fred became, by that point, Fred had been his business manager. And if you're wondering how they survived on the sale of works. They had a lot of works that hadn't been sold. And Fred, between 1968 and 1972, Fred was very busy selling the works that they had, and they had literally hundreds of them in storage. The second phase of his work begins in 1972 when Warhol went back to work. And this late phase is referred to as Warhol himself called it business art. I refer to it as the period of art and commerce. As we'll see, there is art produced here, but there is also commerce. There is the mixing of those 2 phases of his career. The move, as many people say, is the move from the factory to Andy Warhol Enterprises. And what I mean by that, the factory, as many of you know, was his studio in the 1960s. And it was an incredible scene. There was an open door policy. And there was always literally dozens of people walking around, wandering around. Half of them, Warhol didn't know who they were. It was a 24/7 party going on. And the crowd that was there was an extraordinary mix of speed freaks, amphetamine, of gays, socialites like Edie Sedgwick, the most famous of the socialites, but not the only one. And street people, like Valerie Solanas, okay, who were just wandering out of the street. And after Andy was shot, he had to close that down because he said he was too afraid. He said he was afraid these people were too dangerous, okay? Way too dangerous, and he was afraid that somebody was going to do it again. And under the influence of Fred, Andy Warhol opened what was literally called Andy Warhol Enterprises, and they had an office with a receptionist and and suits and ties, and the people he hung out with changed radically into business people, the wealthy, socialites, okay, and the focus, as Warhol said, the focus was on business art. He said, being good in business is the most fascinating kind of art. Making money is art, and good business is the best art. So commerce, dedicated to commerce. And there are 2 arms of this commerce. One of them, before I do that, he did also make art, and I want to make that clear, okay, before we go too far. He also produced art in this period. Now, Here are two examples. Death remained a major subject in his work. He had a great phobia of art, a great phobia about death, not because of simply that death meaning the end of life, but he was a devout Catholic, and for him, death meant the beginning, the possibility, and in his case, he felt the probability of him going to hell. So he was very, very deeply afraid, deep phobia about death. He also produced some openly religious art. And again, this is what art that came out of real conviction. So there was in this period a lot of work produced that was, again, legitimate art. Much of it is not as strong or as interesting as the stuff he did in the 60s, but art nonetheless. But the commerce, on the other hand, there were two fundamental arms of the commerce side of things. And one of them was the society portrait business. And this was the mainstay of his enterprises. He spent time every week trying to encourage various people to do portraits, taking them out to lunch and socializing with them. And here just are two very good examples of it. This is a society portrait of Dorothy Lichtenstein, the wife of Roy Lichtenstein, and Halston, of course, the designer. And these are society portraits. They're a later manifestation of the society portrait. And of course, whereas Boldini was selling elegance, Warhol was selling fame. Warhol made these people look like movie stars. And that's the hook that he was selling. The other side of that work, of course, was the prints. I meant to say the prices of these things. The $25,000 for one, $15,000 if you wanted a second, $10,000 if you wanted a third, and $5,000 if you wanted a fourth. So there was a very, 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 very businesslike. Very, very businesslike. Now, to get this business going, Fred Hughes and one of his associates, a dealer in Zurich, decided to this in 1972 when Warhol went back to work. In order to get the business going, in order to prime the pump, what they would do is they would produce a portrait of the most famous man in the 20th century. And the Zurich dealer and his associates did a lot of research, and they decided that the most famous man in the 20th century was Einstein. And so what they asked Warhol, they asked Warhol to do a portrait of Einstein, which they said we can sell, and we can use this as a way of promoting the business of portraiture, okay? And instead, Warhol did this. Fred and Bruno were not pleased. Fred and Bruno said, wait a minute, we can't sell that to our clients, okay? This is the enemy this is the enemy. This is the father of communism. Now he did this, of course. Well, he did this, of course, because in February of 1972, Nixon had just gone to China, a move that surprised the entire Western world, and opening relations with the enemy. Okay, and it was a shocking development, and quite frankly, one of the best things he did. But we won't talk about Nixon. So Warhol decided this was famous. The man was now famous. Okay, well, I'm going to do him because he's famous and everybody's talking about it, and wouldn't it be a wonderful subject? Now, what he's done here, he used the image from the Little Red Book. The Little Red Book was the title of the book, of course, is Quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong. It's known as the Little Red Book because it was just a tiny little red book. It was produced between 1964 and Mao's death in 1976, and even today it was one of the most printed books in history. And on the video, Betsy Newman, clearly an ex-communist, was talking about her interest in. Is Betsy here? Is Betsy here? No. Yeah. I'll have to apologize to Betsy for that one. Anyway, she has interesting reminiscences about the Little Red Book, which many people we're interested in. So and now what's interesting about it, of course, and as those of you who have heard the tape know that what he's done here is he's transformed it. And what he's done is to turn it literally on its head. He turned, first of all, somebody who was colorless, the image is colorless, and Mao himself was colorless, into a colorful figure. The most important thing he did, however, was adding these brushstrokes. Now, this was a new development in Warhol's work. Warhol had never used this brushwork before. These are paintings that they are silkscreen paintings, but after finishing the paintings, he then took a brush and just went over the surface with this big brushy surface over the thing. Now, the point to understand is that this brushy surface has an iconography, has a meaning, has associations. It's the epitome. It's comes straight out of abstract expressionism. It's an expressionistic device. Now, Warhol is not expressing himself here, okay? What Warhol is doing is using this as a sign of expressionism. So he's identifying this man who is the enemy of what? The enemy of self-expression, identifying him with expressionism. So he's literally transformed him into, but it gets even better. In 1972, he produced mass-produced now, over 2,000 images of Mao, okay? Paintings of Mao, okay? And he made them in small, medium, and large. Just like Starbucks, okay? He produced them in any color you want, just like a Chevrolet, okay? He has, and in fact, even went beyond that. The medium size, okay, I guess those would be the Ventes, huh? The Vente Maos are on Mao wallpaper. You can even get Mao wallpaper to decorate your home. So he has taken the enemy of capitalism and he turned him into a capitalist product, okay? Now, what's going on here, of course, this is not commercial art. Warhol was a capitalist artist. Here he is celebrating capitalism by showing you what capitalism can do. And of course, it was really interesting in terms of what happens in China, okay? It moves in the direction of capitalism. So this is now legitimate art. This is legitimate art. This is art expressing his convictions. It's funny, it's amusing, but it's deep. It is, as I've said, he did to Mao what Duchamp did to the Mona Lisa, turned it on its head, turned from man to a woman, from high art to low art, and as many of you know, the LHOQ lowers it down. The mustache and goatee takes this high art object, the very epitome of high art, and brings it down to the subway. The LHOQ brings it down to the level of the bathroom. If you sound it out, it says she has a hot ass. Okay, which also transforms the enigma, answers the question: why is she why is she that little smile? She's thinking about sex. Anyway. And Warhol doesn't get credit for being a Duchampian, okay? But Duchamp was one of Warhol's favorite artists, and he took a lot of lessons from Duchamp. And anyway, now he also produced a series of prints, and which is what we have here featured in our gallery. And here are the 10 prints. So, in addition to paintings, okay, he also produced prints for a different market, okay, completing what's available to you. Not only paintings in small, medium, and large, not only wallpaper, but also prints. An edition of 250 of them. I don't know what they sold for, but they, fairly reasonable at the time. No longer. Now, and of course, they don't have the painterly surface, because you can't get that painterly surface in a print. But instead of the painterly surface, what he did in the screens is these little squiggles in the screen. Those little squiggles in the screen are the counterpart of the painterly brushstrokes in the paintings. What they stand for, again, is free expression, because that's what they are, just freehand expression. Now, the other thing that you need to notice about these is, for the most part, they're very unattractive. They're not really very beautiful, are they? Some of them more unattractive than others, okay? And it takes a while to see this. But that itself seems to be, in this case, seems to be commentary. What he has done is, in fact, he has said, this is an unattractive character, okay? This is a critical comment that he's making on Mao. Very different, okay? Very different, of course, from the aesthetics that mattered so much to him and that we find in so many of the other works in the show, like the Gertrude Stein. Now, the Gertrude Stein, of course, brings us to the more commercial side, okay? Because for the most part, the prints that he produced were not art in the best modern sense. For the most part, and I say for the most part, I'm not entirely true of all of them, but so much of the prints that he produced were purely for the market, were purely for commerce, for purely commercial reasons, were to appeal to an audience, were to pander to an audience, in fact. One of them, of course, is the 10 portraits of Jews of the 20th century, which we have the entire set here. This was suggested by a New York dealer, Ronald Eldman, who came up with the names. Warhol didn't know half of these people. He knew the Marx Brothers, okay? But many of these people he did not know. And the purpose of these works was simply to sell prints. That's the only purpose, okay? Critics at the time were horrified by it, and it was one of the reasons that Warhol's reputation in the 1970s and 80s really slipped, because so much of the work that he produced was of quite obviously and clearly of a purely commercial, just simply for the money. Critics called it Jewploitation, okay? This is a market. This were meant, of course, to appeal to Jews. You buy the entire set, or you pick out your favorite Jew, right? Gertrude Stein, my favorite Jew. Okay. And again, what we see here is a portrait. It is a portrait. But it's not a portrait in the way that Picasso's Gertrude Stein is a portrait. It's not a portrait that gives us understanding of who and what Gertrude Stein was. I mean, Picasso gives us a man, yeah, sorry, that's a slip. Gives us a woman of enormous strength and focus and power, gives us a powerful figure. And what Warhol has done is he simply put a decorative veneer over a recognizable face. That's all he's done. He's chosen this face because you will recognize it, okay? Recognizable. And he's made it attractive. Why? So that you will buy it and put it on your wall. So it's a work that is meant to be your Gertrude Stein, okay? One of the things that I've said about him, and one of the most interesting things about him is in many ways, even in the 1960s, he gives people open signs. And he understood very well that the meaning of art will always reside not in the artwork, but in your brain, okay? In the way that artwork reaches you and what's in your mind, okay? And he understood that's always the way it is, and he played into that, okay? And so what we have here again is your Gertrude Stein. This is recognizable face that you can hang on the wall. It's a collector portrait. It's a collector portrait. It's for somebody who is interested in this subject. The same thing is true of the athletes, okay? The athletes are collector's portraits, okay? Here too, this was suggested by a collector. The collector, in fact, commissioned 10 paintings of famous athletes, and he decided who the athletes are he wanted, and then Warhol then produced prints off of those paintings for sale. These are the paintings, and what we see in the gallery are some of the prints. For example, Muhammad Ali. This is from a portfolio of 4 images. These are 3. I couldn't find the online. I couldn't find the other. The other one is in the show. Anyway, but again, these are for people who are fans of Muhammad Ali. And the success of those can be very well seen in the remarks made by Michaela Pilar in her responses to these works, and talking about how important Muhammad Ali was to her and to so many blacks, because he was a black who was more than an athlete. He was an intelligent man who spoke about issues, and she. Her testimony is quite moving in terms of the way this man opened a door for her and for others to be able to say what they want to say and how they want to say it. But again, this is your this is your Muhammad Ali. Do you want him thoughtful? Do you want the thoughtful Muhammad Ali? Do you want the shy Muhammad Ali? Do you want the black power Muhammad Ali? This is up to you. He opens it to you. And it is for sale. It's not to celebrate. He's not celebrating Muhammad Ali. Now, there are works in the show that are not just for sale, that are not just to make money. This is a very interesting work, this image of Paloma Picasso. And it's a very strange image, too. It was from a series shortly after Picasso died. The 54 artists were commissioned to do a work in homage of an homage to Picasso, and almost all of them made variations after his work. Picasso very interestingly chose one of his works, his daughter, okay, and he provided a very, very interesting portrait. Because what you find here, there really is a person here. There really is a face here. This is a genuine portrait of Paloma Picasso, a woman who seems strong but shy, doubtful. Here she is being covered up by these shapes, and to my mind at least, these shapes refer to formalism. Her father was the father of formalist art. Okay, he was the father of art about different shapes. And so here she is, both taking advantage of that and being covered by that. So it's a very interesting portrait. Then there's also Jean Cocteau, which references this was meant for sale, of course, but it has another purpose as well. It was also meant to celebrate openly gay artists. Warhol himself was gay, and he was always very angry about the fact that in the 1950s and 1960s he had to hide that his condition, and after 1970, after the beginnings of the openly gay movement in 1969, 1970, he began to produce more openly gay subjects, celebration of gay figures like Jean Cocteau, whose in fact graphic style meant a lot to him early in his career, and that's also the subject. That's also the subject here, homosexuality. This is a series. There was 10 of these. We have 4 of them. I think 4 of them or 5 of them in the gallery. And in 1975, Warhol. This was not a commission by anybody. This was Warhol's own choice. He sent a friend out to a local drag club, asking for volunteers who would like to have their photos taken. He paid them $50 a piece. Warhol was notoriously cheap. You'll really notice that in some of the diary entries that on the audio, where he's constantly keeping track of what everything cost. How much the cab ride was. Okay, how much dinner was. Okay, again, it's a product of. He was a product of the Depression. Product of the Depression. He was always very, very tight-fisted. Anyway, paid them $50 and asked them to come in and to produce this series. These are transvestites and drag queens, and it's hard. We don't know which were the transvestites, which were the drag queens, but transvestites and drag queens. And he took these Polaroids in his studio, and then he transformed them. And what you're seeing here, of course, is this is political. This is political art. This is sexual politics. Okay, and very interesting sexual politics. I mean, he is dealing with issues here in 1975. This is the height of the gay gay revolution, but it's also the height of the AIDS epidemic. when most of the attention being given gays was given to them as victims. Here's Warhol is trying to celebrate some heroes of the queer nation. Those men who are openly expressing who they are, what they are, and as you can see, unabashed. And these are not necessarily portraits of individuals, of course, because they don't have individual names and they don't have a great deal of individuality. They are portraits of a type. This is a celebration of a type of human, and he's transformed these images of them into something very, very attractive. As you can see, he's uses strong colors, and again here an expressive line. Here, this line here is these squiggles here are not expressionism; it's expressive. It tells us about them. It tells us about their energy, their vitality, their strength of personality. And so here he is celebrating something that only recently, of course, it's only very recently with the whole Caitlyn Jenner business that attention in our culture. This is now 40 years ago, 1975. He was, as he sometimes was, way ahead of his time in terms of the celebration of a particular gay type. And again, you can see the difference here. One of them really is a person here, the other is a decor. So to end, what we have in these prints, really is, in what we have in the other room is really art and business. Some of them are business, and some of them are genuine art. And you've got to figure out which is which. Thank you very much.